I'd like to welcome all of you who have stayed with us after the previous session that Jeff Curran and Kim Goldsmith presented. We'd like to provide what is in some ways a bridging session between this and the session that will follow on mechanisms in implementation science, and speak to you about approaches for evaluating complex health interventions. Jane Sandall will begin, and I will follow with some brief remarks, and then we will open up for your questions. And as before, please feel free to submit questions via chat, which we will either call on you to ask them verbally or read them, or we will unmute lines so that you can ask your question directly. So Jane, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. My screen has disappeared.
Jane, it's Kim. We can see your talk, although it's not in full screen.
Okay. Can you see it now? Perfect. So hello everybody, I'm Jane Sandall, Professor of Social Science, Women's Health at King's. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the MRC framework, and then Brian is going to follow with some exciting new work from America. So I wanted to highlight why I think this is an important issue. We have an implementation challenge. Too often, interventions that work in small pilots don't live up to expectations when they're rolled out, because there isn't enough information about strategies, or the failure to transfer from one country to another because the context of the original study has not been well described. So the original MRC framework was developed for evaluating complex interventions. It has 4 phases of the theoretical development and modeling of the intervention, the feasibility of it, the evaluation, and implementation. So what I want to go on to take you through is some of those key processes, because this is where implementation research intersects with evaluation of complex interventions. So in terms of context, we're drawing on our theories how the intervention works. In terms of implementation process, it's how what we measuring our implementation outcomes, and then we're trying to understand our mechanisms of impact. So this paper by Graham Moore, which talks about process evaluation, has this really neat diagram which gives you throughout the whole process what types of implementation research we would do. And then in addition, you can see how at each stage of feasibility, evaluation, and post-evaluation, how we're going to look at these different processes. So I think the final point is that if you're putting in a grant application, certainly panels, grant panels, are now looking at is there a clear description of the intervention? Is there a clear description of what's happening in the standard practice? Is the implementation strategy described and specified? Is there enough detail about context? Does it consider implementation outcome variables? And do you have a way of looking at secular changes over time? This, I think, is where the implementation of the science can really improve the evaluations that we do. So I'm going to hand over to Brian. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can click over and share mine. So let me know if you can see my title slide, please.
Yep.
So, Jane, that was, I think, by far the most concise and clearest presentation that I've ever seen of the MRC work, so thank you. I'd like to continue in the same vein, and as Jane indicated, provide just a brief overview of some of the work that the PCORI Methodology Committee has been conducting. Let me begin with a brief, if I can have my slide move, a brief recap of the underlying motivation as we have understood it in the work that we're doing in PCORI, and that is to focus very specifically on the kinds of questions that we as researchers hope to guide, and the contrast between the typical question that we face in conducting effectiveness research, and that is to answer the simple questions, does the intervention work or is it effective? Should it be approved by our drug approval agency? Should it be funded or promoted? And even for clinicians, should the drug be used or the intervention be used in practice? So if we think about these simple questions, does the intervention work? Is it effective? Clearly, for many drugs, we have a clear answer, yes. The drug works for many patients or most patients. There are exceptions, of course, and precision medicine is having us think a little bit more about the exceptions to the general rule of a robust intervention, that this drug works for some patients. Different versions may work for others, and I'll get back to that issue of heterogeneity in a moment. There are some robust complex interventions that are highly effective across multiple settings for multiple target audiences. But more often than not, when we're dealing with complex health interventions, if we ask the question, does it work or is it effective, our research produces a very unsatisfactory answer along the lines of sometimes or it depends. So clearly, conducting research on complex interventions to answer the question, does it work, is it effective, is just not useful. So rather than think about these simple questions, is it effective or does it work, we should be thinking about a set of more complicated questions. How does the intervention work? Why, where, when, for whom? But also something which is especially noteworthy for those of us studying complex health interventions. We have the ability to ask and answer the question, how can we enhance its effectiveness? We have the ability, unlike our drug research colleagues, to actually modify the chemical formulation, the actual content of our interventions. So with a simple intervention such as a drug, we can only ask the question, does it work or for whom? But we can't actually modify the intervention. In our case, we have the ability to enhance effectiveness, to modify the intervention. As a consequence, our research should be intended to support those decision-maker roles and responsibilities. So this is the set of methodology standards that the U.S. Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute has developed to guide research on complex health interventions, building on the UK MRC work and a number of other published sources of guidance. We don't have time to go through these. What I'd like to do, though, is focus on the first with just a couple of additional slides before we open up for questions. But as you glance at these, clearly they are the sorts of standards that you would expect, and again, are fully consistent with the MRC guidance. We're interested in causal pathways. We're interested in adaptations. We're interested, of course, in a process evaluation. And I will emphasize, building on some of the comments and work that Kim Goldsmith had described, that we're very interested in promoting quantitative process evaluation and studies of mechanisms of effect. And Kara will talk about this directly after our session, in addition to the more common, the more prevalent qualitative process evaluation. But I indicated a special interest in the first method standard, in something that the PCORI methodology group has not introduced, but we believe is emphasizing and encouraging in a way that hasn't occurred in the past. And that is based on the idea that I mentioned previously, the idea that complex health interventions almost always can be adapted or tailored. They almost always will be adapted and tailored, irrespective of our efforts to ensure fidelity. But more importantly, complex health interventions should be tailored and adapted. And as a consequence, the argument is that we should be embracing and studying and ultimately trying to guide adaptation rather than approaching it as researchers too often do, which is to ignore or attempt to suppress adaptation and tailoring. And the basis for this approach is Penelope Hawes' distinction between core functions and forms, and the important distinction between the underlying purpose or intended effects of an intervention versus the actual activities or the format or the operationalization. In some simple examples, oftentimes our interventions, especially if we're dealing with health promotion interventions, emphasize patient education. That is the core function. The function is to educate patients to improve their knowledge. There are a number of different forms that we can use to carry out that function. And there's some other examples listed on this slide. There's some very important implications of forms versus functions, namely the idea that if we take a core function approach to describing and studying our complex health interventions, the concept of a manualized intervention with a highly specific, highly detailed protocol doesn't make sense. We do not want to specify the details of the activities, or in other words, specify the forms, but instead our manual should specify the functions along with the menu of forms. The idea of core components or activities, components of an intervention that are considered critical, again, we need to rethink if we take the core function form approach because there are no mandatory required forms or activities in intervention. There is a set of often mandatory principles or functions, but we can typically operationalize those functions through a variety of different forms, many of which can be substituted. We should not be measuring or trying to achieve fidelity to forms. It's not following the script or the protocol, but instead fidelity to core function, ensuring that that function is carried out through any number of different forms. The concept of evidence, again, we need to rethink to the extent that we often think of evidence as the estimate of the average effect size of an intervention. Again, the argument is that complex health interventions are not either effective or ineffective, but instead their effectiveness varies. And finally, the implications of this sort of thinking for research. Our role as researchers is not to measure effectiveness or to find effective interventions. Our role as researchers, when we're dealing with complex health interventions, is to understand their mechanisms of effect, understand how they operate, where they're effective, and again, to understand how to change them, to modify or tailor them to make them more effective. So let me stop at that point and stop sharing and open up for questions. And again, please either pose questions through the chat so that we can call on you, or if you turn your video on and wave, we will activate your audio and ask you to pose your question verbally to the group. Thank you. And as we're waiting, Jane, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts or comments regarding the relationship between the MRC, the guidance, especially the new emerging guidance, and the PCORI approach. But again, the PCORI Methodology Committee has approached this problem with a strong reliance on the MRC work.
I mean, I think there is guidance coming out where you can see like the tidier intervention description guidance is helpful as long as it's applied to a description of what's happening in the control group or in the standard practice as well as in the intervention. And that's now being used in systematic reviews as well, which is helpful to help us understand. I suppose one question that came up to me as you were talking is we're all trying to understand what works for whom, in what circumstances and mechanisms. If anyone has tried to bring in realist evaluation approaches into this field, because I think that's very exciting when you bring those approaches into don't know if anyone has done that.
And just if I could just add and respond, the approach that we are promoting through PCORI is very much equal amounts of attention and encouragement to researchers, as well as, of course, to funding agencies to support robust, strong, quantitative assessment of mechanisms. And again, Kara Lewis will discuss that in the next session, as well as a very strong theory-based evaluation, realist evaluation, and other approaches that are more qualitative, with the ultimate goal of understanding mechanisms. So again, equal amounts of interest in need for robust qualitative and quantitative. So Churchill indicates that we have a question from Jack in the chat. Jack, if you could go ahead and pose your question, we can unmute you.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Again, fascinating presentation. Really exciting to see what's happening in the space moving forward as well. I've used the MRC framework in a number of studies, and am also very interested in feasibility studies. So there's some work by Proctor and Bowen that was done around about the same time, 2 separate studies. So the new work that's coming out, I haven't actually seen yet that you were talking about, Brian. Does that actually tie in some of those concepts that are found in the feasibility studies that aren't necessarily in the MRC framework? I can give you an example from Proctor or Bowen if you'd like that.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, I think, for my benefit, but also the others, a brief summary of the example I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, sweet. Okay, I'll just pull it up so that I get this right. So pretty much the Bowen study looks at acceptability, demand, as well as implementation, then practicality, adaptation, integration, expansion, and then also introduces the concept of limited efficacy testing, which may or may not be appropriate, for example, if you're doing a full-blown implementation RCT. But there are a number of concepts within those points, and I haven't, for the sake of others asking questions, I won't go through all of those, but they do focus beyond just implementation and reach to, for example, really closely looking at acceptability and demand, which is often something that is overlooked in studies to start with.
Yeah, so I think there is broad consistency, and I think the work that you've described does help us to move in the direction that's encouraged by the MRC guidance, the PCORI guidance. In a simple way to think about it is this idea that we're moving away from a simple effort to examine associations in a black box manner. If we modify the independent variable, do we see a change in the outcome variable? This is all about causal pathways and mechanisms. How does the intervention actually achieve its effects through a series of proximal impacts, intermediate outcomes, and ultimately, the distal outcomes that we're interested in, and exploring each of those intermediate outcomes and the various factors that influence those using process evaluation, and again, looking inside the black box. There are multiple ways of doing that, but again, I believe that the Proctor-Bowen work that you've described is one approach and contributes to this broader goal.
Thanks.
Other reactions, questions?
If anyone would like to ask a question, you can just indicate or unmute yourself. So you can ask the question to Jane or either to Brian. Thanks.
Ramesh, the question, do you know when the new MRC guidance is out? It was due last year, correct? It wasn't it? Jane, do you have any updates or others on the expected release after they finish all of the internal and external reviews? I think many of us are eagerly awaiting its formal release.
No, I haven't. I don't know if anyone else here has better indication of when it's coming.
Jack?
I think Kim has got a question, Brian.
I'll defer to Kim.
No, Jack, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, sure. I was really excited about the comments made about how it's important not to focus on fidelity in terms of, you know, this is what we said we were going to do, and let's do it. So I know in a number of the studies we've done, we've actually decided to say that the implementation process was actually an intervention by itself. And that has got around that traditional research mindset of, well, here's your intervention. And so, you know, you've got to stick rigorously to that. Whereas if you actually think when you're doing an implementation process, that actually by itself changes the outcome. So when we're pitching to funders or when we're pitching to different groups, we actually say, and even when we're presenting our results in manuscripts, we say, well, actually, you need to also consider the implementation process as an intervention. It's not even just the vehicle that sort of carries what you did. It is specifically part of an intervention that needs to be considered. And I guess that's the crossover then between process evaluation and the outcomes evaluation is, even though the implementation is a process, it will definitely influence the outcomes.
And just a
Any
very
comments
quick
on that?
remark. Yeah, so a quick comment, you know, that in some ways, you know, I would interpret as highlighting the importance of core functions because we need to understand what the needs are and what the implementation process does for us. So, you know, recruiting sites by dealing with leaders and encouraging them to be interested and supportive, even if they're not directly involved in delivering the intervention, that leadership support carries out one of the important core functions. There are other ways of carrying that out, but I agree that explicitly identifying each of these core functions, understanding the ways in which different activities or different forms operationalize those, critically important to explicitly recognize, to document, and to write up those perhaps under-recognized influences, as you're pointing out.
There are two questions in the chat. One from Shalini and one from Annemiek. Shalini, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Hi, I'm Shalini. I work here at the Center for Implementation Science, and I'm working in the area of global health, primarily surgical site infections, and looking at the implementation of complex interventions in Asian and African settings. And it is so hard to disentangle the components, the form and the function. And I was wondering if there are any reporting guidelines as a part of the, I don't know, the UK Implementation Society, or are we doing some work around that area? And does everybody have similar challenges? And I think you just did allude to a few of these in the previous comment. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I can make available a list of some of the, you know, very new and emerging publications that talk about core functions and forms, both methods for identifying core functions, for developing a set of forms. You know, I think the issue of reporting guidelines is somewhere down the road, clearly needed. But there is a lot of new and exciting work, especially within the States. This is one area where we may be ahead of the UK in implementation science and complex health interventions in promoting an idea that Penelope Hall from the UK originally introduced. I'll work with the conference staff to make sure that those references are made available.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we at time, or do we have time for the last question, Churchill?
Yeah, you've got 3 minutes before Kara's session, so I'll just put the slide when the time comes.
Okay, so Annemiek, you have a question?
Hello, yes, my name is Annemiek Konijnendijk. I am from the Netherlands. I'm a postdoc researcher in the field of implementation science. And one of my projects is a European project in which we help regions to implement and evaluate quite complex integrated care interventions. And one of my aims or my tasks is to support them in operationalize those components from those theoretical frameworks. So they really need to measure in their practices, implementation process and outcomes. And I'm really seeking for some maybe questionnaires or other instruments that I can use to help them to measure those outcomes. So I was wondering if there are some questionnaires or other instruments that people are aware of and that can be helpful for me.
So I would actually ask Kara Lewis, who is following us to talk about mechanisms, but who also is among a small group of national leaders in the States and perhaps internationally working on that problem. Kara, if you could provide an answer at some point during your presentation rather than have us try to provide a lesser quality answer, although Jane, you may have something to offer as well.
No, I think we're at full time, I'm afraid. And we good to. Cara is saying, remind me if I forget to.
But the short answer, Annemieke, is the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration and some work that Kara is leading with the team is attempting to inventory and characterize instruments, including instruments that address the very categories of variables that you've asked about. So thank you for the question to tee up an opportunity for Kara to display yet another facet of her work.
Okay, thank you.
The same link is active for Kara's presentation, so you don't need to leave your screens. You might just want to get a cup of coffee or something while Kara gets prepared. Thanks.
Thank you.
And we do have, I think, one more minute before it's all Kara's, if there are any final questions or comments. So I'll express my thanks to those who joined us and for your questions, and my thanks to Jane as well for leading the session and allowing me to throw in some comments on the PCORI work to supplement the UK MRC work, which was the focus of our session.
Thank you.